So now I'd like to go and introduce Nick Brokaw, who was our speaker for this evening. So Nick, I've known him for a long time, since we first met in Puerto Rico. But Nick began his career of research in tropical forest in Panama, and he did his PhD at the University of Chicago. Since then, he's mainly worked in Puerto Rico and Belize, and he's focused on forest structure, forest dynamics, and species composition, and land use history. And he's recently retired from being a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and well, he still lives there. This talk is collaborating with Sheila Ward, who received her PhD from the University of California, Davis. She was a research forester at the International Institute of Tropical Forestry in Puerto Rico, and she's taught courses and development at the university there. She works on forestry in Mexico, and she's been working in Belize with Nick. And Laura Snook is another collaborator. She did her PhD at Yale. She's taught at Yale and Duke University. Her focus is also on tropical forests in Mexico. She worked for the Center for International Forestry in Indonesia, and she's now with the FAO and Biodiversity International in Rome. So I look forward to having this lovely presentation, and as I say, we can have questions at the end. So handing over to Nick now, please start, and I'll mute myself.
Thank you, Julia and Jill. I hope you all can hear me. And thank you all for attending my talk. The talk is about our work in Belize, but I'm going to start with a little story about Panama. About 40 years ago, I was in a boat crossing the Panama Canal and talking to a friend of mine on the boat, Dr. Alan Smith. And I think Al had been thinking about the research that had been going on over the years at nearby Barra Colorado Island. And he said, you know, Nick, research follows 3 stages in natural areas. And I listened to him and I thought, now that is a simple, interesting, useful framework. And so now, 40 years later, I'm going to use it in this talk and add a little bit, and I'll share that framework with you. So we're going to talk about our work here in Belize. You see shown by the red arrow, and there's a map of Belize on the left. Belize is about, just to give you an idea of the dimensions, is 290 kilometers long, 180 miles. And the really wonderful thing about Belize for the naturalist is that there is so much unspoiled natural habitat there. I was really lucky, and with my teammates, in the late 1980s, to be invited to work in the Rio Bravo Conservation and Management Area, which you see here located in northwest Belize, up near, as you saw on the other map, you find the boundary with both Mexico and Guatemala. This is an area of 100,000 hectares, more than 250,000 acres. Subtropical moist forest, gets about 1,500 millimeters of rain per year. And it has, what's really interesting, a lot of old growth forest. So this was really a naturalist's dream. And we were given the job of investigating the ecology of the area and writing a general report about it. But we've ended up a lot of research there. It's a very complicated area. There's a mosaic of vegetation types, which can be seen in this airborne synthetic aperture radar image from the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. What you see in this image, you see shapes, you see colors and different shapes and graininess. And these all indicate very faithfully distinctly different vegetation types that are connected with the topography that you see in this diagram here on the left, created in 1959 by Charles Wright and his colleagues, a team sent out by the UK to survey the entire country of then British Honduras. But if you look at this diagram, which shows the principal things to focus on, a very good cartoon of the structure of the forest, the topography, slopes and level areas, and then soil depth. You can see how faithfully vegetation types follow that those variables. And having walked around there a lot, this is an extremely accurate diagram. All these other numbers are codes for different soil types and so on. And so if you look at the, going back to the diagram, this diagram is reflected in this, I mean, the air SAR image, the diagram is reflected in the diagram. So for example, the red areas are palm forest. The deep blue areas are a thick swamp forest. The areas that are more light colored and with sort of a broader grain are upland tall forest. And you can see both how these things are distributed across the landscape, but also how they relate to topography. This is a long, steep escarpment. And particularly interesting here is you see this forest of palms. This is a big palm. And what's happened here is you can see that there are a series of ravines that come down, which over thousands of years have been dumping sediment here, creating a really favorable environment for plant growth. And this is where palms grow, in a place that's level, deep soil, but not soaking wet. The whole area is kind of a vegetation mosaic like this. So for example, here's a picture of upland forest. And just to show you where it's located on the diagram, you see it here, faithfully shown by Charles Wright. This is a tall forest that for various reasons thrives on steep slopes like this. By contrast, you've got what we call bajo, which is level areas that are very poorly drained and really wet during the dry season and dry in the dry, wet during the wet season, of course, and dry in the dry season. And it's a thick kind of vegetation that you can hardly get through. And all these things occur in a kind of patchwork mosaic around the landscape. So in 1988, we went there, and our job was to describe the ecology, describe the forest ecology. And of course, when you arrive in a place like this, and there's very little has been done, you think to yourself, how in the world are we going to get started on this? What do we do? This place has never been studied. Where to start? So here's one of our teams in the forest contemplating this difficulty. So this is where Alan Smith's framework came in. What did we do? This is what Alan Smith told me. He said, you know, in the beginning, you don't even know what's there. So the first job is to figure out what species are there. Trees, if that's your interest. And that's going to take you a while just to figure out what's there. But once you've figured out what's there, then only then you begin to see patterns. If you can recognize the tree species, then you start to see how different species are distributed across the landscape. And you start to pick up patterns and you start to do quantitative work on that. But it requires being able to recognize the species. So that was our first job. But then after you've figured out the pattern, of course, you ask yourself, well, what is it that has caused this pattern? That's when you start working on processes, or at least guessing at processes and looking at things that are correlates to the pattern that give you a hint of what the processes are. These are the three stages that Alan discussed with me. But then I've added a fourth one, which comes after you've understood composition, after you've understood pattern. It depends on knowing composition, and have some idea about process, which depends on understanding pattern, and that's management, how to manage the forest and conserve it. So I'm going to use this framework to go through some of the interesting points about our work here. When I first arrived, it was just a big green blur. I did have some background in tropical trees, but I didn't know what was what. There was a vast number of species. So one of the things I did was I went to the Missouri Botanical Garden to make my own field guide. They'd given me permission to go into the herbarium here. I had a list of tree species for Belize, 750 species. And I pulled out specimens of about 600 of them. And I looked at all of them, and I found what I thought was the best specimens for seeing the key features. I made photocopies of them on large format paper and then put them in big ring binders. You see here, 7 big ring binders, and carried this thing to Belize and used it as my handbook for the trees. It was, of course, I learned a lot just from spending all those days and nights in the herbarium and then putting this together. And this is what I used in the beginning, with also some background knowledge, of course, because I'd worked, as Jill mentioned, in Panama before. But this enabled us to start identifying the species. And of course, we collected. Here, for example, is a conspicuous species, Luia speciosa. Here's our collection, and here's a specimen from the Missouri Botanical Garden. So we collected to learn and, of course, to verify our identifications. This was perhaps the most fun, almost the most fun stage of the work, because it involved a tremendous amount of exploration and learning new things every day. And we finally got to the point where we knew enough about the trees that we could construct our own field guide, which is shown here, that treats the more common species on the basis of identification of sterile characteristics that you can really see right in the field. And here's some examples of, this is not a page from the book, but shows some examples of this species and some of its distinctive features. Buteria amygdalina, like this reddish edge to the buttress here, and these curved petioles like that, green contrasting with tan stem. These are things that through lots and lots of experience of looking at thousands of trees, we figured out that's the thing that you can use in the field to figure out what this tree is. So it was a great satisfaction. I grew up on field guides, so it was a great satisfaction to create one myself. So composition was a big challenge. It was a lot of fun. And then we began to work on patterns. And the questions there were, what species are abundant? How are tree species distributed across the landscape? And one of the studies we did to this involved establishing sample plots scattered across the landscape, and well, actually in arrays like this, in which we censused the trees. So we had 209 of these sample plots, each of them 400 meters squared in area. They were circular. And in these plots, we recorded the topography, and we took soil samples. And we identified and tallied up all the tree species. Of course, there were some unknowns, but here's a typical one of the trees that we tallied up. So by the time we got to the end of that, we had some 4,000 trees, about 150 species. And we came up with this graph. This is my all-time favorite graph. I don't know if any of the rest of you have a favorite graph, but this graph is my favorite because to me, it expresses the fascination, the mystery, the great aesthetic pleasure of tropical forest. And what it shows is a rank order abundance distribution of tree species. So down here on the horizontal axis, we have more or less 150 species ranked from most abundant, as shown on this axis, to least abundant over here. Of course, as in any natural community, there's some really common species over here. There's some middling common species, but especially in the tropics, there are a lot of really rare species, and all these little bumps here indicate species that among those 4,000 trees in those 209 plots, we found just one individual. So there's some really, this is what I love about tropical forest. Obviously, there are lots of species. And then there's this mysterious curve which characterizes nearly all species. And then there's the great adventure of going out in the forest. And usually you're seeing these species, but every day you find something over here that is really uncommon, and maybe quite likely you've never even seen it before. So it's a tremendous amount of fun to do this. So here is a pattern that we came up with. It's not unique to the forest, but nonetheless an interesting pattern. Here are some of the really common species. We saw this in a previous picture, Drypetes brownii, and then Puteria reticulata, which is the most common canopy level tree species in the forest. And by the way, is also common throughout the region. It is also, for example, the most common tree species of canopy level that you find at Tikal, the famous Maya site in Guatemala. So another thing, so the next thing we wanted to know is how are these species distributed across the landscape? And we used those same data, those 209 plots, to get a look at that. We took the data from each of those plots and we constructed a non-metric multi-dimensional scaling diagram and other diagrams. And I'll explain to you what this means. This is an ordination. And on this diagram, each one of these dots represents one of those 209 plots. The computer sorts out the composition of each of those plots. They're usually about 20 on average trees per plot. And it figures out how different and how similar each plot is to every other plot, the other 208. And then it arrays in this, what's called an ordination array, to show you what the scatter of variation is. So for example, these two plots here are close to each other in the array. That means that they are very similar in species composition. They're not exactly the same, otherwise the plots would be right on top of each other. And so these are kind of similar too. On the other hand, this plot here is really different from this plot up here. Perhaps it probably don't have any tree species in common. So this shows you the scale of variation across the landscape. All these 209 plots, not a single one of them the same as any other plot in terms of composition. By composition, I mean using both which species are there and their abundances. So you can look at this and get some idea what it means. As I mentioned, we took data on the topography and soil, which we'll get to a little later. So we took each of these plots and using our topography data, and that was qualitative data, not quantitative. And we had categorized them in advance by topography. So green represents plots that are on slopes. Blue represents plots that are rolling to level terrain. And this kind of orangish tan represents lowland plots. And I think you can see that there is some pattern here. Of course, this is nature and you've got 150 tree species, so there's a lot of noise. But generally speaking, the plots with blue are in this area, indicating their similarity to each other. The tan orange are over here, and the greens are over in here. So they're not discretely separated according to topography, but they definitely have a tendency toward topography. This is not news. Every forester knows that site conditions influence tree species composition, but it is gratifying to see that it still works when you have some 150 tree species. By the way, the 150 that we encountered is not the total number of species in the area, probably up to twice as many, depending on how far away you get from where we were working. This is species over 10 centimeters in diameter. So here's a pattern that conforms to that diagram I showed you, the Charles Wright diagram. We can also do this with individual species. This is a diagram showing the very same plots, again, distributed in ordination space according to their overall similarity in species composition. But this time, the colors are the same, hilltop, slope, and rolling to level. But in this case, the size of the symbol, these pyramids, indicates the number of individuals of Brosmum alicastrum, Ramon, in those plots. And what you can see here is that Ramon is kind of partial to the uplands, the slopes, the rolling to level, and there's some near the slope bottom. There are very few down there in the lowlands. Maybe it's a little too wet or something's missing down there. So you can go through all our tree species and you find that most of them have preferences like this. So we're beginning to see patterns, and we're beginning to maybe understand something about process. So I'm going to go to process next. I don't have actually isolated mechanisms to show you, but I can show you what perhaps causes some of those patterns. So here's Braswell and Meliaceae again. We took that ordination. Remember, I told you we gathered data on soil. And we did the same thing with the soil data. So for nitrogen, for example, again, you have this exact same array of plots, the original plot array according to their similarity in species composition, and the same color scheme to show topographic situation. This time, the size of it indicates the amount of nitrogen in the soil. So there's a lot of nitrogen on these slopes. This is where Braswell is. It's a correlation, but at least we're starting to learn a little bit about what maybe determines or influences the distribution of tree species. A little more something about process. And there, we could do this with other species and nutrients. Now turning to another kind of process, history. Everybody knows that the Maya were a big presence in this area up until about 950 AD. And this diagram here has been created by some archaeologists to show the general patterns of Maya population and their environment going back 5,000 years and coming up to the present. Here we have Maya population. They trickled into the area about 3,000 years before present. Whoops. They started to get more population really built up. And then for some reason, about 950, it crashed and went way down. While the population was going up, in order to support themselves, they chopped down the forest and grew crops. But after their population went down, the forest came back. And this is the key thing that will make sense to be important in the next several slides. You chop down the forest, soil erosion, as geoarchaeologists have determined, went way up during the peak of the Maya population, the rise of the Maya and the fall of the forest, and then soil erosion went down after the crash in Maya populations. Here's a friend of mine, Tim Beach. He's a geoarchaeologist. He digs soil pits, and then he goes down there and he dates the layers, and he can tell you when the layer accumulated and what it's made of. And he has shown that over time, the Maya caused a tremendous amount of erosion, which you see here. This is his image of before deforestation. You have the bedrock here, and you have the upper piece of soil, and you have runoff, of course. And of course, through time, the soils are always deeper down at the bottom of slopes. But after deforestation, that process really increased, and the hills were stripped and became the soil became thin up there and thicker down below. So the Maya had a major impact, at least in hilly areas, on the depth and probably a bunch of other things about soil, water, and nutrient content on soils throughout the region. And this, I reason, has had a huge impact on the present day forest. Here's our diagram again, showing how soil depth and slope and so on influences different forest types and species composition. And here's our other diagram showing the connection of a species to soil, to topography and probably soil. And from these studies, we know that tree species have different requirements for soil and water. Well, the Maya really changed soil and water during their heyday of agriculture. And then after they left and the land was repopulated by trees 1,000 years ago, they resumed their positions on the Katina according to their, I'm assuming, their preferences for soil, but their geographic position was then different. There was a lot more territory like this with thin soil and more territory with thick soil, which no doubt meant that the populations of the species after the Maya were different from what they were before the Maya came and started deforestation. So this is another process, I think, which has determined the patterns we see today. there's a lot more to be said about the Maya impact on the forest, but we don't have time to go into that now. Now, let's turn now to management. So Al Smith mentioned composition, pattern, and process, and how you had to know composition to understand pattern, you had to know pattern to understand process. The next phase, which we have added, is management. How do you manage and conserve the forest based on what you know about process, pattern, and composition? So I'll mention a couple of things that are related to management. Remember that I mentioned that this forest is old growth, and there's a lot of interest in old growth forest. It's biologically diverse, but it's disappearing planet-wide. And we had an opportunity to study it here. And one of the things we had an opportunity to do was look at its long-term dynamics as a baseline to figure out how it is changing now in our era of accelerated global change. And so we had a chance, since we began that work, as I said, in the 1980s, to come back year after year and see what was happening in old growth tropical forest. A little bit about why we think this is old growth. We'll go back in history a little bit here. This is another diagram from Wright, the great Charles Wright, his book on British Honduras. The first thing, however, is that the archaeologists tell us that in our area here, where Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize all come together, there's been almost no people living since the time of the decline of the ancient Maya in the 10th century. And there are many historical records which indicate that as well. And starting back in the late 19th century, a big London-based timber company had control of 1 million acres here and did nothing but fairly light selective logging, which left the forest really intact. So the forest has been there about 1,000 years, most of it. There have been some farms. This is Wright's contribution. He mapped all the farms and farming area in the 1953, I guess it was. And the crosshatched areas indicate where there was farming, and the dots indicate the number of farming household farms. Here's 4 for this huge area. So the bulk of this area in 1950, but the historical records indicate going back to 950 has been in forest. Also, another way you can judge old growth forest is by certain physical parameters. You have highly complex 3-dimensional structure. You have big trees that are big, given the climate. And by the way, this big one here, which is being measured, is a mahogany. And so you get an idea of how light the selective logging was. Even when they quit logging 20 or 30 years ago, that was a heck of a big tree. That is a very valuable tree, but somehow they didn't get to it. And then also, large lianas are characteristic, as shown in the picture here, are characteristic of old growth forest. And then finally, another key thing is we tend to think of forests as being, old growth forests as being self-regenerating. The canopy dominants are in general represented by a lot of regeneration, seedlings and saplings in the understory. So you kind of guess that, well, in future, the forest isn't going to change that much. But there are changes, and that's what we're going to look at. We set up 3 inventory transects. Here's another one of these AirSAR images. You see what 5 kilometers looks like. Again, the complicated topography, the variety, the checkerboard of forest types. And I'm just showing you where we put in these transects. This we did in 1991. And we had a forest plot in each of 4 forest types. We had one in upland dry forest, which is on upper slopes with thin soil. We had one, which is shown in the picture. We had one in upland mesic forest, lower slopes, level areas, and deeper soil. We had one in palm-dominated forest on deep, well-drained soil, the one I showed you in the AirSAR image that was red. Not a widespread, but a very interesting forest type. And then there's riparian forest along rivers that very significant, importantly, flood occasionally. And here you see an example of a riparian forest here at Rio Bravo. The guy in the picture is Stephen Brewer, who is an extraordinary expert on trees of Belize, who has helped us out. We set up, the transects were 1 kilometer long and 10 meters wide. That's 10,000 square meters equal to 1 hectare. This is a fast and easy way to set up a plot. They're permanently marked and GPSed. In 1991, we did this in 1991. We did not have GPS then, but we went back and did it recently. And in this transect, so here's the baseline. Within 5 meters of the baseline, we found all tree species, all trees greater than 10 centimeters in diameter. We identified them to species. Of course, there are many unknowns. We took plant specimens. We mapped them, their position in the transect. We measured their diameter, and we permanently marked them. That was in 1991. 25 years later, we went back and redid these transects. So we were able to figure out what happened in 25 years of change in these old growth forest plots. And here's some of the data that we have. Here we see what happened in terms of the numbers of stems greater than 10 centimeters in diameter in each of these transects. On the horizontal line you have the forest types: upland dry, upland mesic, palm, and riparian. And then on this axis, you have the number of stems. Now, for most of them, there's not much change. This upland mesic went down 13 fewer trees after 25 years. Palm forest went up 3. Riparian went down 14. That's not much. But here in the upland dry, where there were a lot of stems at the beginning, there was quite a drop off in the number. And I think this is due to natural disturbance, which doesn't disqualify the plot as being old growth. But I think about 25 years before we set up this plot, we set up the plot in 1991, there had been a severe windstorm, perhaps the edge of a hurricane. I don't think the hurricane passed over. But that created some big gaps. And by the time we got there, a lot of secondary species had come into those gaps and were growing up. So there was such a somewhat higher density of stems, or at least there were more stems. And then when we came back 25 years after that, in 2015 or 2016, a lot of those secondary species had died. So the number of stems had died back. So the lesson here about dynamics of old growth forests are, yes, they can be pretty stable in terms of stem numbers, but natural disturbance can make them pretty dynamic too, in terms of stem number going up and stem number going down. We can look at this in terms of turnover too. And there's some pretty interesting things going on here. Again, we have forest type on the horizontal axis. And over here, we have percent mortality and percent recruitment, as shown with red bars and blue bars, similar to the last diagram. By percent mortality, I mean the number of trees that had died between 1991 and the 25-year census. The percent that were there in the beginning but were no longer there, that dropped out. By recruitment, I mean the number of trees, the percentage of trees that were present in the 25-year census that were not there, at least as 10-centimeter diameter trees in 1991. Again, there's several things going on here that are interesting. Percent mortality and recruitment more or less match each other in upland mesic, palm, and riparian. These forests are pretty stable in that regard, but in terms of stems, but in actual fact, turnover really varies. And the really interesting thing is this, the riparian forest. Half the trees died in those 25 years, and half the present trees were new, had been recruited. This is an extremely dynamic forest. And the reason I think is that because it's just a really good place for trees to get started and to flourish at least for a while, because it's got plenty of moisture. It's got probably rich sediment soil, but at the same time, it floods every so often, which destabilizes the trees and they fall over. So there are lots of tree fall gaps, which encourages more, and mortality, which encourages more regeneration. So again, natural disturbance is making this a very dynamic old growth plot. Now, what's going on down here with the mortality, with again, the upland dry? That one is actually, even though it had more stems and higher mortality, is the one that also shows this one actually shows an imbalance between mortality and recruitment, and that reflects the original graph I showed of stem number. This reflects thinning here. This is the original the mortality. There was a lot of thinning, and when thinning occurs, of course, there's not recruitment to make it up. The trees are getting bigger. The secondary species are dying out. So that one is falling back to a position of fewer stems, higher mortality, lower recruitment. Again, the differences here, both in mortality and recruitment within a plot and between plots, are due to natural disturbance. These old growth forests are subjected to natural disturbance, and they are pretty dynamic. And this can be a kind of a baseline as we move into the future to understand what's happening in these forests in the next 25 years, which would be wonderful to get there, but I probably won't, to look at it in 25 years. This again, I think I went. Okay, this is the number of species. I see. Okay, this is the number of species. Again, species number hasn't changed very much. It's changed a lot so again, you have number of species year 1, number of species year 25, forest type down here, and number of species on this axis. This one had a lot of stems. When you have a lot of stems, it's a simple species area relationship. There were a lot of species. With the decline in number of stems, reduced number of species. These are all more or less the same. Not much change over 25 years in these forest types. This palm forest is low because of the high palm dominance. But then again, here's the interesting thing. There are a lot more species than in any of the highest species number is in the riparian forest. And that again is because it's so dynamic. There's lots of gaps formed. There are lots of sunlight coming in. Almost every species can flourish there at least for a time before it topples over due to flooding. So over the long run, there's a lot of species turn up in the riparian forest. Now, the last a second management story I want to talk about is the forest industry. Much of the history of Belize is a history of trees. The original economy was based on logwood, which is this swamp tree seen here that was harvested for dye. You could make a nice purple dye out of it, and it was pretty valuable, and people went in, cut it, shipped it off to Europe. Well, that died out when they came up with artificial dyes, but it flourished for a while. Meanwhile, mahogany became the big driver. This Swietenia macrophylla, which you see here, became the big economic driver in Belize, and was for 100 years or so. And there was little agriculture in Belize. It was really dominated by forest industries. So it's very important to understand logging and forest industries to understand the history of Belize. And you can see it goes back away. Here's some logging methods in early 20th century. You see that guy up there on the scaffold with an axe. And you can imagine how much work he's got to do to cut that tree down with that axe. Here's a more contemporary picture of a guy with a chainsaw. They're both cutting mahogany trees. Here's the import-export data from Belize, recorded recently up until 1993. And it was kind of, first it's shown in both The board feet is the gray lines. And then when they started looking at it in terms of cubic feet, they have the black lines here in this histogram. So you have the year going back to 1801. You have board feet here in thousands and going up to 1993. It really began to peak in the 1940s and has dropped off ever since and has become a much less important part of the economy. The reason it probably jumps up later here is not because there's more mahogany, but because they reduced the cutting limit probably from 80 centimeters diameter to 60. So immediately this opens up a lot more resource. But that's not managing mahogany, that's mining mahogany. And the problem with mahogany is it doesn't reproduce in the intact forest. It requires major disturbance. In the Yucatan Peninsula, where Belize is, this usually occurs due to a hurricane and then a fire afterwards, according to Laura Snook, which gets the mahogany trees going, and they live a really long time and produce a lot of seeds. And so it's a very intermittent but abundant regenerator. But in the present day, these sort of conditions don't occur as much as they did. And so we were tasked, led by Laura Snook, with developing a management system where we could harvest the forest and promote the regeneration of mahogany. So we devised a system of sampling in large blocks with multiple treatments. And I'll explain this. Here is a block. And in the block, there are several areas that we cleared by one means or another. So there was a 500 meter squared area. And these were rectangular, just as you see them. That was convenient. 2,500 square meters, 1,000 and 5,000. In other words, half a hectare. And then in the center of these, and I don't have time to go into the details, we planted mahogany seedlings so that we could standardize. We varied the treatment, but standardized the regeneration. The idea being to see how well the seedlings did, depending on the size of the area cleared. And I can't go into it, but we also had other experiments where we cleared in different ways. We used a bulldozer, we just chopped down the trees, or we did some other technique to see what promoted mahogany the best. And we had multiples of this. Here's an old road. These are the multiples. You can see the treatments are rearranged randomly in each block. Then we went back after we did this to see how the seedlings had done. And the idea was that loggers who are now using more species of trees could make these cuts, and maybe we could plant seedlings and have both large cuts, large regeneration of seedlings, and still a lot of intact forest in the part of the management area of Rio Bravo that is dedicated to forestry. Most of it is a forest preserve, the reserve that we work in, but some of it is forestry, which is needed to support the reserve. So here's some of the results we got. If you look at percent survival over these years, these lines indicate they follow the percent survival here, time here, the fate of seedlings starting at 100% through the years. And not surprisingly, the half hectare clearing had the highest survival. Testigo, that means control in Spanish. Testigo, the control, was just a uncleared plot in the forest where we planted seedlings. And as I say, they do not survive in intact forest habitat. Likewise, growth. The size of the opening through those years, I guess the time scale here is throughout the time period of this 96 to 2001, I forget. But anyway, we have growth on this axis, and we have size of opening. Growth was highest in the half hectare plot. So both survival and growth were highest in the half hectare plot. This is more or less what we expected, but we were eager to demonstrate it. The other thing I need to tell you is that these plots just regrew so fast. even the ones we cleared this half hectare here, but the whole thing just grew up really, really fast. I mean, this forest comes back. I mean, sure, it's secondary forest, but there was no long-term damage done here, and we did learn a lot about these seedlings. So those are the steps as described to me by Alan Smith that we ended up following in our research in the Rio Bravo Conservation and Management Area, which we were so fortunate to be asked to study from the beginning when there wasn't much known and there was very little infrastructure and nobody else's work to build ours on. But it gave us the chance to start at the beginning. And this composition phase, as I say, was one of the best phases because it was all about exploration and adventure, frankly, and the wonder of learning species. And then these other phases, of course, have their own rewards as well. The last point I want to make, we're now down here working with the management and still the processes and all these things, but all these phases, none of them end. They all keep going. We're always finding new tree species. We're always figuring out what's there in the forest. We're always seeing new patterns. We're always understanding new processes, and we're always hopefully coming up with ideas about how to manage and conserve the area. If you want to know more about what we're doing, here is a website that you can go to that we maintain that has these contents. And if you would like a copy of our field guide, you can download it here from this page on the website. We didn't do this by ourselves. We had lots of help from all these organizations. The one I want to mention in particular is the Program for Belize. They manage the Rio Bravo Conservation and Management Area. As stated here, they are a Belizean organization, and this is their website, and they have 2 research stations there, very rustic research stations that you can go to. And it's 250,000 acres of really intact ecosystem. It's a great pleasure to go there. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was very interesting. I love to hear about forests that I've never managed to visit.
Well, someday.
Yeah, someday I'll come and help you.
Sure.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions from expert tropical forest ecologists that you've probably heard of. John Grace asks, since you have the diameter of stems, have you estimated the carbon sink as done by Oliver Phillips and his colleagues?
No, I have not done that yet. We have, of course, as I mentioned, we did measure the diameters of the trees and we have growth data. What I will say is that the growth, for the most part, in the old growth forest is really low. Of course, it varies among individuals, some growing fast, some of them in 25 years have put on 1 millimeter. So that's something we certainly intend to do, is to look at growth, the carbon situation, and in particular looking at growth to try to help out with the forestry program there.
Well, that's good. Well, we'll look forward to that being published at some point. One of the things I thought might be helpful for some of the participants is what is the difference between the secondary forest trees and the primary forest trees? You mentioned secondary a few times, and thinking about carbon, can you explain to the attendees what the difference is?
Oh, well, I don't base that on my understanding of their carbon content. That's not my field. I base that on my understanding of their life histories. And as you know, there have been various schemes for categorizing trees according to their life histories. There are the the slow-growing primary species, shade-tolerant. On the other hand, the rapidly growing sun species, short-lived sun species. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. The really interesting thing to me is what are called the long-lived secondary species that require an opening, like the pioneers, but live a really long time. And that's where there probably is a lot of carbon. Take this picture here of Barba holote, Cahoba arborea. That is, you won't find that. You find individuals like this in the forest. You do not find saplings. This is a long-lived tree like mahogany that only comes up once in a while and probably lives a pretty long time like mahogany. So I think that if you look at the dynamics, you're going to particularly focus on these big trees, as many people have. The bulk of the trees in the forest, on the other hand, are shade-tolerant species that live a very long time but do not get this big. These are the sabas and mahoganies and that sort of the things are the standout trees, particularly this type of tree, which probably has a lot more carbon than the low-density wood like Saba. But my assessment of that's my assessment. We have not studied the carbon itself. I'm sure there's work on wood density and so on for these trees.
Thank you. So David Burslem asks, is the mahogany restricted to one or more of the topographic habitats?
No, it's not. I would say it's less so on the upper slopes, the upper dry slopes, but it can be found everywhere else. The big one I showed you was in a riparian forest. It even grows in those bajos, which we haven't studied, which are really, really thick, swampy places. But it grows best, I would say, on the lower slopes and in the riparian forest. It's not restricted to any particular spot on the topographic sequence.
Okay, thank you. So I was wondering about when the experiment you set up, was that in all one type of forest, or did you have it?
Oh
in
yeah,
the
yes it was.
types?
Yeah, that was. Yeah, we tried to hold that. Control for forest type. We did that in another place where there's a greater expanse of similar forest than in some of those pictures I showed you. Some of those remote sensing images I showed you.
Okay. There's a couple of questions about fungi. Did anybody look at the mycorrhizae and how they changed over time in your different sized experimental plots?
No.
So is it possible for people to go and still do some work in those plots?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. The program for Belize welcomes researchers. Of course, you have to get a permit from them and from the government and all that, but one is welcome to go and study there. The wonderful thing about this place is that hardly anything has been studied. so
plenty of opportunity then if there's money available.
Yeah. I mean, getting yourself there and the funding and all is another subject, but nobody's going to be there and say, oh, I already did that.
Okay, well, that's promising. We'll have another question about fungi. Do you know of any emergent fungal diseases that are threatening the forests in Belize?
No. That's all I can say on that.
Okay. Matthew Rees is asking, in the soil data that you have, do you know which of the elements are driving the species diversity or the stem diversity in each of your 4 topographic regions?
I say no. We need to delve into those data more. That information might be there, Matthew, but we haven't gotten there yet. What?
Okay, so there's even more work we can do.
Oh, gee.
Yes, I was wondering how well protected the forests are in Belize. Are they in danger of being chopped down for farming? John Grace wondered about fire. And does the local population clear the forest for agriculture, like happens in Brazil?
I would say they're better protected than elsewhere, quite a bit better protected. On the other hand, there are threats. The government has de-gazetted some of their forest reserves. These are national forest reserves. and there's always poaching. You look at the size of the Rio Bravo Conservation and Management Area, there's a huge perimeter there. It so happens, though, that the perimeter areas, the margins are pretty uninhabited as well. So for now, there's not a particular problem. As for fire, that has been a problem recently because there's been clearing on some sides of it. And with the debris left over from clearing outside the reserves, legal clearing, but that promotes fires. And so the past couple of years have been some fires that have entered the undisturbed forest as well.
Oh, that's a shame. Are there indigenous people still living in the forest?
No. No.
Did they have they since the Mayans?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, since the Mayans, there hasn't been local indigenous populations that have been managing it.
Not in this area. The historians and the archaeologists all agree. It's just been pretty empty. I mean, as you know, the decline of Maya happened before Europeans arrived. Mm-hmm. And of course, there have been people passing through, and there was some, travel up some of the rivers to get logwood, but no settlements.
Wow, that's it's amazing to find that. Even nomadic people passing through did manage the forests. I just as a personal question, I noticed that some of the species that you talked about were also found in Puerto Rico, and I wondered if you'd how many species were common in Puerto Rico and in Belize.
Well, I would say, at least where we work in Belize, I would say just a handful, probably. Mm-hmm. Just a handful, really. They're mostly different. However, there are, if you go to the western part of Puerto Rico, which is drier, you will find more species there that also occur in Belize, because Belize is, at least northern Belize, is also dry like that. But with the part of Puerto Rico that you're mainly familiar with, the wet northeast, very little overlap. There's very little overlap in species composition with the area we are studying in Belize.
Oh, well, thank you for putting those ones in that I knew.
Okay.
So there doesn't seem to be any more questions. So at this point, I'd like to thank Nick very much for his talk and the participation of Laura and Sheila. And I'd like to thank all of the participants for joining tonight. I hope you enjoy the talk as much as I did. And you will look at the website that Nick mentioned. And if you need any more information, you can write to me and I can remind you of that website. It seems that once Julia ends the talk for the participants, it actually closes it down for everyone. So I won't be able to talk to you anymore, Nick, after this session, but we'll be in touch soon. And thank you again very much for a lovely talk.
Thank you all, especially Jill and Julia.